Probably a couple decades back, a friend of mine tragically lost a child. Child was very young when she passed. And we went to the funeral, and during the ceremony, the ministry did a beautiful job with it. Everything was very well conducted, and it was pretty calm, even though it was very emotional, as those kinds of funerals are, until it came time to leave. They're getting ready to close the grave, and the family's loading up in their vehicles to go. And the mom was having a really hard time leaving. So her husband and another relative, they helped her into the truck. But when they closed the truck up, she absolutely lost it. And she starts screaming and trying to get out, and she slams her head into the windshield of that truck from the inside, and it just shatters the windshield. I've actually never seen anything just like it. The pure force that she hit that windshield with, it's an absolute wonder that she didn't end up hospitalized from it. When you're looking at something like that happening, and you see the sheer force of such grief-driven rage, it leaves you processing a lot of things about what's actually going on here. I'm Dr. Robbie Willis. This is the Deliverance Dialogues. But so we're going to switch seats, so to speak, today. Help us understand trauma. Help us understand why we need to understand trauma.
I think first of all, it's important to define our terms. They enter a state of fight or flight where their body is their brain is trying to find a way out of the situation. And your body doesn't know the danger's gone because your body never was able, your brain was never able to get you out of it.
I'm Timothy Willis.
I'm Dr. Robbie Willis.
And this is the Deliverance Dialogues.
You know, Timothy, as I reflect back on that moment, I remember that a lot of the people standing around had a lot of questions about why she was responding like she was, about the sheer strength that she seemed to display in that moment.
Yeah.
But it made sense to me. I understood it, and I understood it for this reason because, as you know, your mother and I also buried children when we were young. If you've never walked through that kind of grief, that kind of trauma, it's hard to really process what somebody's feeling on the inside. Now, I never reacted that way externally, but what I saw that was happening in her on the outside, I had lived with on the inside for a very long time, actually. In this whole conversation, this ongoing dialogue that we have about deliverance, sometimes trauma is a real blind spot for us. Now, we've talked about trauma in here before, and how even about 2/3 of cases of demonization have some level of trauma that are involved in those. But then there's this real deep grief in and of itself, these traumatic moments where nothing in your life really prepared you for what you're facing now, right?
Yeah.
And if you're standing there watching and you don't know what's going on, it can look demonic. It can look like maybe there's some kind of mental illness going on there. I mean, certainly someone who is out of their mind enough to put their head through a windshield is, by some definition, possessed.
Right.
But what she was possessed by wasn't a demon. It was pain. Mm-hmm. Pure, unfiltered, unbearable pain. Now, I've been a pastor most of my adult life, and I've got a fair amount of experience in this area, as well as, you know, personal life experience and a good deal of research. But you will next month walk the line with a psychology degree. And so as we were preparing for this, I really thought to myself, I wondered what kind of light you could shed on this subject for us from a psychological standpoint. And I'll share some things from a deliverance and a pastoral standpoint along the way. But whereas a lot of times in these conversations, I kind of lead and then, you fill in the blanks. For I know that for those that are watching or listening, it's been a little while since we've shot an episode, but so we're going to switch seats, so to speak, today. And I want to invite you to just kind of guide this conversation where you feel like it needs to go. Help us understand trauma. Help us understand why we need to understand trauma. And then along the way, we'll talk about how it ties into this whole deliverance conversation as well.
Sure. I think first of all, it's important to define our terms. When people talk about trauma, a lot of times I from what I've seen, people refer to literally any little thing that got to them as trauma. And I'm not going to sit here and say like there are certain things that can and can't be traumatic. People respond to things in such different ways. Sometimes the loss of a loved one almost seems to hardly faze a person, and sometimes it's absolutely devastating and they can hardly move on. Right. But from my studies anyway, and I am about, like you said, a month away from holding in a bachelor's degree in psychology. So while I'm by no means an expert and I'm by no means a psychologist, we have studied a lot about the brain, about human behavior, and a lot about trauma. And I've read a lot about trauma. So one of the main things that causes a trauma response is the brain's fight or flight system going haywire, right? There's a book that you actually introduced to me, The Body Keeps the Score, which is by Dr. Kolk. We'll link it in the description. It's a fantastic book. I think if you're to read one psychology book ever, I think it's the most important one you could read. But Dr. Kolk, vital. He says that what happens with trauma, and specifically he's talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, but when somebody goes through a traumatic experience, they enter a state of fight or flight where their body is their brain is trying to find a way out of the situation, right? I think now we call it the fight, flight, or freeze response, where either you're going to try to fight your way through it, you're going to try to get away from it, or sometimes you're so overwhelmed by emotion that you freeze and can't do anything.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but when that happens, basically from my understanding, you move from the higher brain function where you're making rational decisions like with your frontal lobe down into what some people call the lower brain. I've even heard some people refer to it as the animal brain.
Sure.
Where it's being driven by instinct, basically.
Yeah.
Is that basically correct?
Yeah. Your brain develops in 3 phases. So the first thing to develop is the cerebellum. So the motor function, basically your reflexes, right? You jerk your hand away from a stove when you touch it and it's hot. That is a motor reflex. That's the first thing to develop. And then in infants, the next thing that develops is the midbrain, which includes all the brains, like emotional centers and what's key is fight or flight response, and a lot of the brain's memory centers as well. So rational function doesn't actually develop fully until later in life, until you're like a toddler. So like a lot of times you have people who say, well, if you have I have a 9-month-old at home, right? And people tell me all the time, well, he's crying, just let him cry it out. He'll eventually cry it out. It's not how it works. The baby cannot regulate his own emotions because the rational function's not there yet. So he'll cry and cry and cry until he either wears himself out from exhaustion and passes out, or I come and pick him up, right? So that's the part of the brain, is that lower level of the brain that activates when fight or flight is triggered.
Right.
It is an animalistic. If you're an evolutionary biologist, which I'm not, but if you're an evolutionary biologist, they'll say it's the chimpanzee brain, right? It's the animal brain, and it is fully devoted to getting you out of a situation by any means necessary, by pumping your body full of as much adrenaline as it can.
Yeah, I think it's somewhat of a miracle. I mean, I think God hardwired that into us to keep us alive in times of great threats or danger. Yeah. So it's a real gift, except when you get stuck in it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and so what happens, according to Dr. Kolk anyway, and I mean, he is one of the foremost experts on the traumatic response. He was one of the people who wrote into the DSM-3. That's the third edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders. Right? I think I said that right. He was one of the people who helped write up a PTSD diagnosis. Right?
Yeah, we're currently in the fifth edition. The text revision.
They're about to hit a 5.5 actually. So you're gonna have to buy another one. But
don't get me started.
So, but what Dr. Vander...
Real quick, how many people has the DSM cured? None. Carry on.
Yeah. That's a whole rabbit hole we could go down, but
this is why you're leading though. So go ahead.
Read the Body Keeps the Score actually has a really good discussion about that.
Perfect.
So, Dr. Vander Kolk said that what happens when you go into a trauma response is your brain is doing everything it can to get you out of that situation as fast as it can. Right. So your digestion shuts down, your heartbeat speeds up, your pupils dilate, and your body's pumped full of so much adrenaline that you feel like you can do anything. Right. Anybody who is a combat veteran knows that feeling very, very well. So what happens when your body, though, can't do anything about it? What happens when you are stuck in that situation with no way out? Say you're a victim of sexual assault. Say you're the lone survivor in a squad of soldiers, right? Or say there's an example in the book of a woman who was trapped in a car in like a 200 car pileup, and she was watching people die around her. And there was nothing she could do. She was stuck in her car, forced to watch people die and smell the smell of burning rubber, basically, for hours. What do you do when your body's doing everything it can to get away from that situation, but you can't, right? And so at that point, that's where trauma sets in. And what happens is you walk away from that situation. You walk away from whatever had triggered that fight or flight response, and your body doesn't know the danger's gone because your brain was never able to get you out of it, right? You survived either by sheer luck or divine intervention or something, but your nervous system's still firing on all cylinders.
What's really interesting about that, I mean, as you're describing what's happening in that trauma response, that fight or flight moment, pupils are dilated, heart's racing. You didn't say this, but often there's a certain level of dissociation taking place. That is, you're not really anchored in rational thought. You're identifying threats. And a lot of things are shut down
because your prefrontal cortex mostly shuts off.
Right. What's interesting is from a deliverance standpoint, that is very much what we see happening when we often say a demon is manifesting, when a person's experiencing some type of spiritually induced rage. We're seeing a lot of this, but here's where I think a lot of people miss it. And no doubt I've misinterpreted things at times in my life, is that what you see happening that can be spiritually induced, a lot of this can also be psychologically induced.
Yeah.
And as you're talking, as we've discussed this before, we've got to be really careful to differentiate between phenomena that are mostly psychological versus phenomena that are mostly spiritual. And I say mostly because we're spirit, soul, and body. We're not spirit, soul, or body. So there's interacting elements here.
It can be such a gray area too, because things that affect the mind affect the body. I think we'll talk about that later. Things that affect the body affect the spirit, and we're so interconnected that it's so hard to pin down what's the root cause. I mean, if you're a psychologist, obviously you're going to say it's psychological. If you're a doctor, you're probably going to say it's biological. If you're a pastor, you're probably going to say it's spiritual. It's probably some of everything.
Yeah.
But there, we can definitely pin down, I think, the most important question you can ask, and when you're in a deliverance session, you can pin down, where did this start?
Good.
Or when did it start? Right. And so if you can find out, well, it all started when I got in a 15-car pileup, it's probably psychological. The root is probably psychological. Or it all started when I had my first epileptic seizure. It's probably biological at the
This
root.
is really important for our conversation also, because for anyone that may happen to be dropping into this conversation, you haven't watched the last 17 episodes or whatever, we are not using the terms deliverance and exorcism synonymously, okay?
Yeah.
I have a book that's actually coming out with bearing the same title as our podcast. It should be out the end of this month sometime, very likely at least being published through Whipfenstock. And in it, I lay out some of those areas of differentiation pretty clearly. When we talk about exorcism, we're talking about removing an evil spirit or something undesirable.
Yeah.
But when we talk about deliverance, we're really having a far broader conversation that deals with not only the area of spiritual liberation, but also with psychological integration, inner healing, emotional healing. And so when you said, when you're in a deliverance session and you start realizing, okay, this started when the person was 15 years old, are we looking to see if there's some kind of spiritual intrusion? Well, of course we are.
Yeah, for sure.
But also the fact is there are times you're talking to somebody that has never discussed the things they're sharing in those moments. And so the emotions and the energy and everything that's coming out is overwhelming, and sometimes I would dare say terrifying. But it's not a demon; it's trauma. It's that you're suddenly ripping the lid off of this stuff that's been bottled up inside.
Yeah,
and the amount of healing that comes rapidly when somebody receives permission in a safe space to let that out. Absolutely unbelievable.
Well, and that is the basis for, and again, this is in Dr. van der Kolk's research, as well as other psychologists and medical doctors in some cases, but that's the basis for therapies like EMDR therapy, or some kind of somatic healing therapies.
Right.
I'm not condoning going and reading somatic healing gurus, but there's lots of published literature on the topic that is legitimate that you can read. And that's the basis for a lot of that, is that when you're in a fight or flight response and your body's still firing on all cylinders, what you need is some kind of resolution.
Yeah.
Right. So if you were in the car, let's keep using the car pileup,
Sure.
right? You're in the 15, 20, 200, whatever. You're in the pileup and you can't get out of it. You need some kind of resolution at some point for your body to recognize, or your brain to recognize, okay, the danger's over now. I can relax. Otherwise, you have all kinds of other issues. The key point of the body keeps the score is that trauma does not only affect you psychologically, but also physically. It can cause autoimmune disorders where the body attacks itself. It can cause gastrointestinal issues, which is probably because fight or flight causes your digestive system to slow, like dramatically slow. And if you're constantly running in fight or flight mode, if you're constantly in danger mode, then you're going to have stomach issues. You're going to have other issues,
That's a really good point. Something that the body keeps the score, really a gift that it really gave society and bringing this conversation forward. And there's another great book. The author's name has escaped me at the moment, but it's called The Soul Also Keeps the Score. It's written more from a Christian perspective, whereas The Body Keeps the Score is more from a secular perspective. But these types of writings really helped us, because in the past, if someone said, well, that's psychosomatic, what people would hear is, well, it's in their head. It's not real. Yeah. But you mentioned defining our terms. So psyche comes from, today we use it to refer to the mind. The actual root word related to the soul is where is the history of the word's usage. Soma is speaking of the body. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about something that's psychosomatic, we're talking about something that originated in the mind but is affecting the body in a very real way. So something that is psychosomatic, it's not in your head, it is very much in your body, but the route to healing, it's not with a pill in most cases, though you may need to use some medication for symptoms and whatever.
Sure.
The route to healing is going to be through therapy, deliverance, some type of emotional inner healing. I mean, I've known numerous people who have psychosomatic or psychogenic seizures, and I've seen them having seizures. It's very real. It's very troubling. It's very frightening at times. But it has a psychological root, and you heal it by addressing the trauma. And until we begin to realize, you know what, there are people that have faced a lot of things and their bodies are dealing with the effects of that, we're going to be unable to really help a lot of people. And so body consciousness, becoming aware when you're feeling this deep grief, okay, where are you feeling that at in your body? Yeah. That can really give a step toward understanding what's happening.
Yeah. No, you're right. And I mean, we were talking about this earlier, that when you feel strong emotions, it is a very physical sensation. You know, people, when you're terrified of something, I feel sick. You know, I just feel sick in the pit of my stomach, right? Or you know, all the time you hear people who when they're worried about something, I just want to throw up, right? And it's not figurative. It is, you do feel sick in your stomach whenever you're scared or whenever you're worried, and acknowledging that and identifying that is what's going on is you're right, the first step towards working to heal it.
Now, what's interesting, and I want to go on a brief detour here just for fun. So, and I know that because of the difference in the way that my brain and yours works, that I'm making you crazy right now. So, forgive me.
Been doing this for a year now or so.
Right. So, you know, I've been doing deliverance ministry for, your whole life.
Yeah.
And I don't know how many times. Sometimes I've had people on prayer teams with me that they see a lot in the spirit. You know, they have visions and get impressions and things like this. And so for as long as I've been doing deliverance, there's been moments when somebody would be like, hey, I see something attached to this person's spine, or I see something in their stomach, or I see something on their lungs. And what's interesting is in those moments, a lot of times then we'll go to pray and we'll be like, okay, Lord, would you bring healing to whatever's happening in the lungs right now?
Yeah.
Or we start rebuking whatever's attached to the spine. And you can see people actually healing. You can see people getting freer in real time. And I don't know how many times I've had somebody say, well, I've had pain in my back for years and now it's gone, or something like that. So what's happening in that moment? Well, in my younger days, I was convinced these are absolute demons that have a grip on that part of the body. I'm still not closed to the possibility that that's what's happening sometimes.
Maybe in some cases.
Sure. But in many cases, it could be because God is the healer, and these are moments of healing that we put before the Lord, that what he's showing us is that something that someone has been through has caused trauma that's being stored in a very real way. It's affecting your back. It's affecting your lungs. It's affecting your stomach. It's affecting some of these things. And what's happening in that moment of release? Well, it's God bringing healing in a very real way. And there is an element of what some would call somatic release, meaning that the body's letting go of some things finally. Right. At the same time, is it purely a natural phenomenon? No, it is something God's doing by the Spirit. He's doing by prayer, but there's often a lot of different things that are going on here. So it's not like something's flying around in the room because a demon picked it up. I mean,
that's pretty hard to say, oh, well, that's, trauma.
Yeah, I'm willing to cut past it and say that's a demon, I mean, I walked into a room to pray for somebody and they're like, I know you. And they start talking and they do know me. That's not trauma. That's Satan,
Super creepy.
Sure. But a lot of these things, the fact is we carry a lot of stuff around, and your frontal lobe of your brain is not fully developed really till you're up in like your 20s, according to some studies. But regardless of where you're at, that person back to the car on the bridge, if a person was in that scenario, then they're in a car, they're perfectly safe. Suddenly somebody hits the brakes. Everybody else in the car is fine. Mm-hmm. That individual can't breathe.
Yeah.
They can't function. They can't talk. They can't make any sense. And it makes no sense to anybody around them.
Yeah.
But it's very real to them.
And the thing is, and anybody who has had a diagnosis of PTSD or has PTSD and doesn't have a diagnosis, right? Sure. Or any kind of traumatic disorder, it probably doesn't make sense to them either.
Right.
What happens when you look at brain scans of individuals with PTSD, when they're having an episode, most of the time, the rational centers of their brain are totally shut down, or at least mostly shut down. They're not firing like they should be. What's going on is purely their their memory centers are firing and their emotional centers are firing. Their fight or flight response is jacked up. And for all intents and purposes, in their brain, they are totally back exactly where they were, however long ago it was. It doesn't matter how long ago it was. They're smelling the same smells. They're hearing the same sounds, feeling the same sensations, and they're fully back exactly in that situation, which is why in a lot of cases it's so hard to treat PTSD, because you can't fix that with medication. You can numb it, right? And I'm sure a lot of people have that experience. Fortunately, I've been fortunate enough in 21 years to not have that experience.
Right.
But people who have can tell you that a lot of people don't want to take their medication, or when they do, it doesn't even help.
Sure.
Or it doesn't help as much as it should.
Yeah, I mean, every experience is different, and there are people that seem to be greatly aided by medication. There are others that really don't. And I can imagine that some of our listeners right now are thinking, well, some of what you're talking about sounds very subjective. Even when you say you're praying with someone, all of a sudden they're like, hey, my back doesn't really hurt. Well, that's very subjective. You're right. Here's the thing about mental health care as well as spiritual health care. There's a strongly subjective element to it. That is, to say it another way, the person's individual experience is very real to them, whether it's objectively verifiable or not.
And the thing is the modern sciences love quantitative data, right?
Sure.
We love when we can have numbers and give everybody a number and plot them on a graph. It's really convenient. I work as an RBT in the behavioral health field, and we plot literally everything on a graph, right? And it's super helpful. But not all data is quantitative. Some of it's qualitative.
Absolutely.
Right? There's a whole side of psychology, and I'm sure other sciences. Psychology is the one that I've studied. But there's a whole side of psychology where all the data is purely qualitative, and all we have to go off of, if you're a mental health therapist, is you sat down across from me and told me this was your experience. And that's what I have to go off of. Could you be lying to me? Sure. But I have no way of knowing, right? And so I assume you're telling me the truth. We have this relationship where I assume when you say my leg hurts, right? You go to the doctor and you say, "Doc, my leg hurts." They're probably not going to scan your nervous system and see if your nerves are firing that's consistent with pain, right?
And in fairness, it does begin with the subjective, because the doctor doesn't call you and say, "Your leg hurts, please come in."
Yeah.
I call them and say,
Right.
"My leg hurts, I need help."
So yeah, it is a valid criticism to say, "Oh, all your data's qualitative." Yeah. Sure. Sorry.
I sat on a number of dissertation committees, though, and qualitative research is a valid approach to gathering data. Now, you don't make big claims based on only one situation. No. You have to have a decent sized test population.
All the rules of doing research still apply.
But as you gather these this qualitative data and you begin to carry out this analysis, there is much we can learn about the human experience. Yeah. And then there often are objectively identifiable areas of healing where you can see that people by the numbers do begin to function better as they address these kinds of things.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I mean, if you have one person that comes up to you and they said, "Hey, I saw my dead grandma last night," you're probably going to say, "Huh," But if, 20 people have been to the same house and have seen the same old woman in the same place that's supposed to be dead, probably you're gonna really take it into consideration, right?
Yeah, I might start thinking at that point, okay, maybe there's something paranormal that's going on in the house there. But here's the other side to it. For me, I sit in this exact office and I have conversations with people multiple times a week. If somebody comes and tells me, "Hey, I saw my dead grandma the other day," do I believe their dead grandma appeared to them? Probably not. I don't think grandma's hanging around their house. But for me to tell them, "Hey, your grandma didn't appear to you,"
sure.
At that moment, to start out with that, I'm just denying their experience, their reality, because if they're being honest with me, and when I teach this kind of stuff to pastors, one of the assessment elements that I give is you got to decide if the person speaking to you is being sincere and honest from their perspective.
Yeah.
You don't got to accept their worldview. You got to know, do they believe they're telling you the truth? And if they do, it's very uncharitable to immediately jump to saying, well, they have schizophrenia if nothing previously has determined that.
Sure.
I've got to say, okay, from their experience, they believe this happened. I don't have to objectively agree with them, but I do need to help them find healing, to help them find peace. I do need to understand what their experience has been from their perspective. And then that can lead us forward to saying, is there a medical issue? Do they maybe need to have some blood levels checked, or to quote one of my favorite movies, Dr. Dolittle, back in the day, where Dr. Dolittle calls his friend. He's like, hey, maybe we could meet up for a cup of coffee or a nice CAT scan. I mean, sometimes a nice CAT scan's in order. Yeah. Or maybe it is psychological and they need some therapy, or they need a friend to talk to.
Right.
That's good psychological
and you would be
care.
Shocked. You wouldn't be shocked, but like it is shocking to me how much just one person who's there for you
absolutely
and says, hey buddy, I'm here to talk to you if you need it, can help so much. Right. And you just get everything you need to get off your chest without fear that they're going to run off, or at least not too much fear that they're going to run off. Right. It can help so much.
I want to say this the right way. I am thankful for good mental health care practitioners.
For sure.
And there are cases that are so complex that you really do need a mental health expert to get to the bottom of it. But our society has come to a place where we're so isolated and disconnected that there are a lot of people paying $150 to $250 an hour primarily to go and talk to someone who will listen and care.
Yeah.
Because they don't have a friend, they don't have a relative to do that. They're not even looking for a diagnosis. Yeah. They're looking for a listening ear. Imagine what could happen if we started to let our communities really fill that place again. It'd be beautiful.
And humans are hardwired for community, down to our brain chemistry. Are you're familiar with the rat park experiments, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So for anybody I don't remember if we talked about it on this podcast or not. For anybody who's not familiar with the rat park experiments, basically what they did is it was about drugs is what it was about, but they put a rat in a cage with two water faucets, right? One was just water and one was water laced with cocaine. Right. And so it was like cocaine in one and then heroin in another, but then there was a few. But what they found is that the rat in the cage went to the heroin or the cocaine, whichever drug it was, there were multiple, and killed itself on the drug 100% of the time when it was alone. It went straight to the drugs, and it would just dose and dose and dose and dose until it killed itself. And then that set of experiments was wrapped up, and they were like, okay, conclusive, right? Rats that are addicted to cocaine or exposed to cocaine die, right? And then another set of experimenters came along, and they said, no, that doesn't seem quite right, because the rat was in a cage with nothing but drugs or water. Right. So what they then did is they put rats in what they called rat park. Right. And so they put a community of rats in a bright and cheerful, it was still a cage, but a bright and cheerful cage with lots of places to run, lots of different like shiny objects to play with, and most importantly, other rats to socialize with. And what they found is that at a rate of almost 100%, not only did the rats not kill themselves on the drug, they didn't even use the drug. They tended to prefer the water over the drug. And those that did use the drug would use it once or twice, and none of the rats died from drug overdose.
I think that's mind-blowing. And the initial experiments that basically showed that, okay, if drugs are available, they're just going to keep using. That fueled a lot of the ideology that stood behind the original push for what came to be known as the war on drugs.
It did.
That we just said drugs are so powerful that if our kids get exposed to them, they'll never be off of them. And so what could we do? Well, the only thing we could do is go after the drug dealers. And to be clear, I don't think people need to be dealing drugs on the street, and there needs to be strong laws to address that. However, Johann Hari, in his book Chasing the Scream, analyzed this experiment that you're talking about, and his one-line analysis is phenomenal. He said the rat park experiment concluded that the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it's connection.
Yeah.
What I'm missing is connections with other people. The key to getting off of the things that are controlling me, the key to getting off of drugs, the key to healing my inner traumas, it happens in community.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and so we're, talking about trauma. It's so interesting to me that what causes people to use drugs, right? What causes people to seek escape? It's because they can't get free of what's in their head, right? And a lot of times what you hear from especially sexual abuse victims, right? That population, so veterans and sexual abuse victims, is they become so isolated from the community because they feel like nobody else understands me. Nobody else understands what I went through. And because in a lot of ways, they live in that world still. They live in the place where they were when the traumatic event happened. There's an interesting phenomenon. You were talking about understanding someone's version of reality, right? And not in the sense that I'm schizophrenic and that I live in a fake reality. That's not what I mean. But understanding someone's worldview. There's a type of memory called a flashbulb memory, right?
Okay.
And this is the type of memory that is almost 100% of the time associated with traumatic events. It is not necessarily, it's not necessarily accurate, right, to real events, which is why eyewitness testimony is held kind of like this in court, right? But it is not necessarily accurate, but it is extremely vivid, right? So when somebody has a strong emotion paired with something that happens, something traumatic that happens, you get flashbulb memory. And what it ends up being is it is a audio visual memory that takes you back to the place that you were when it happened. And that's what happened. It doesn't matter. Like, people can try to tell you that's not what happened, but you have this image burned into your mind, right, of the thing that happened.
Right.
And you have the sounds in your ears and the smells in your nose, right? And you know that's what happened, regardless of what anybody tells you. You can go back and rationally say, okay, clearly this couldn't have happened exactly this way, but it doesn't matter, right? You're going to view it a certain way. So you're talking about trying to help people, right? Trying to help people where they're at. It's completely pointless to sit here and say, no, your daddy wasn't abusive to you. Maybe he wasn't, but it's completely pointless to sit here and tell someone who believes that they were abused, or that they were abused and something was traumatic to them. Maybe their dad yelled at them once and that was traumatic to them, even if he didn't mean it like that. Right. It's completely pointless to sit here and tell me you weren't abused, right? This didn't happen to you. Actually, that just further isolates people and drives them into this bed of isolation where the only way out they have is drugs or suicide, right? I don't know if that's cogent, but that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and I think what's happening even culturally in some cases is we struggle to understand that there's different ways that we approach conversations depending on the context. So if we're in a court of law, what matters is objective facts.
True.
Objective, provable history.
Yeah.
This is what happened.
Non-circumstantial evidence, fingerprints, bullet casings.
That's what matters, and that's how you prove something in that setting. But if we're talking about therapy, counseling, friendship, healing conversations, therapeutic alliances, the individual's experience is so vitally important. Now, there might be those that say, well, yeah, but isn't it dangerous to affirm delusions? That's not what I'm saying.
Yeah.
There is a time to push back gently.
Sure.
If someone is just grounded in a reality that's not real. It's not what happened. And there's times when people need to be able to step back and look at something from another perspective. But the starting point for helping someone that is absolutely overtaken by their grief or their trauma is to walk into it. I love the language of the Gospel of John.
Yeah.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And it goes on down a few verses later, it says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. God was so absolutely other than we are, but to save us, he entered our world.
Yeah.
To save us, he became like us. He took on the features of humanity. To help somebody, sometimes we've got to be willing to walk inside their own reality with them while still holding our hand in heaven, so to speak.
Yeah.
So that we can lead them out of the toxic elements of that, but still help them find healing within the parts that are so incredibly real to them that if you just tell them to let it go, all they can do is stop talking about it. Because for them, even if it's not admissible in court reality, it's still their inner reality.
Well, and trauma changes people, and I told you this earlier, but personality is almost 100% stable after you're like 13
right.
to 16, somewhere in there. If you take a personality test at 15 and at 25, say like the Myers-Briggs, and 15, 25, 35, 45, it's going to be largely the same. There may be small variations, but the personality type is largely the same. But if you experience a traumatic event, your personality can completely shift. You become a whole different person, right? And so trying to tell somebody you need to forget about it,
sure.
or you need to get over it, right? I believe, treading carefully here, and I'll cut this if I need to, but that some people told you with your kids that you needed to just like forget about it.
Right down to encouraging me to burn their pictures.
Yeah.
A few months after we had buried Nicholas and Nathan, because you can't hold on to the past, right?
Yeah.
And they meant well. They really did.
Sure.
But in fact, one of the people that told me that was a dear mentor of mine who's with the Lord now.
Yeah.
He meant well, but he didn't know.
Sure.
Right. I got to be careful about giving advice to people based on experiences that I haven't had.
Yeah.
And so since you brought that up, the whole concept of trauma can reorder your personality. I think that's where you're heading, is that personality is relatively stable from the time you're pretty young, but trauma is the game changer. If somebody experiences a traumatic event, it can fundamentally alter who they are. I understand that because I lived that. Yeah. When I was in 2002, when our twins, Nicholas and Nathan, were born, and then they died quite young. I had no grid for that. I didn't know how to process that. It turned my understanding of reality on its head, right? The things I thought that I knew about faith, about life, about relationships, about what was around me, suddenly I had to step back. I mean, I love Jesus, but my understanding of how Jesus works was really affected for a time, right?
Sure.
Of prayer and miracles and faith and all of these things. So this is one of the features of real trauma, by the way, is that it fundamentally changes the way that you begin to view what's around you.
Yeah.
Right. And so leading up to that, but before I was 22, Nathan died the day before my 22nd birthday. We buried him the day after my 22nd birthday. Until that, I was a very optimistic, very positive, pretty easygoing person. Sure. Me and your mom really didn't fight about much ever. And afterward, by the way, I've been married my entire life. We've got an amazing relationship. But afterward, it changed the way that I saw things. Things irritated me that didn't used to irritate me. Yeah. I went from being a pessimist to I called it a realist, which is sometimes an excuse to focus in on the wrong things, right? Sure. I experienced conflict in relationships, even in marriage at times, that I hadn't before. And so we've got to really understand that sometimes people don't just have the ability to just flip the switch back off because they're not the one that flipped it on, quite frankly. They don't know where the off switch is at. Yeah. But
they're probably never probably going to go back to the same person they were.
That is something that Dr. Stephen Diamond, psychologist Stephen Diamond, brings up that I think is vital. He said, part of healing is accepting that our life has changed.
Yes.
And we probably can't go back to the way we were before. And that's probably not a realistic goal.
And it's probably not a bad thing.
We got to figure out who we are now.
Yeah.
Which brings us to post-traumatic growth.
Yeah.
And can you kind of lead us into what is post-traumatic growth? Because, by the way, post-traumatic stress is very common.
Yeah.
By the numbers, post-traumatic stress disorder is a relatively small percentage of those that experience major trauma.
Yeah.
Post-traumatic growth, by the numbers, is experienced by most long-term, by a large percentage of those experience trauma. What's post-traumatic growth? Let's talk about that.
So so I think one of the biggest things about post-traumatic growth is you have basically the opposite kind of person the opposite of a person who develops PTSD, or maybe somebody who did develop PTSD and moved through it, right? Okay. Not got over it, but grew through it. Is you are going to become more resilient,
sure,
and have a greater understanding of yourself and a greater understanding of the world, and grow through that trauma rather than trying to shove it aside. What often happens with people who experience post-traumatic stress, maybe not even post-traumatic stress disorder, but when you experience post-traumatic stress, oftentimes you try to avoid it, right? You become avoidant. People don't sleep because they don't want to have nightmares, right? And so on and so on. There's a lot of different things. But people who confront their fears, so to speak, people who confront who they have become in light of this trauma, are able to grow and become a better version of who they are now.
Wow.
I think an interesting statistic that's related to this is that, it's often said that almost everyone who is an alcoholic had alcoholic family members, right? Or an alcoholic family member. And that's true. What's interesting is that the reality is that most people who have had alcoholic parents or alcoholic family members decide not to become alcoholics.
Wow.
They actually go the opposite direction, right? And so while sometimes we might be led to believe, oh, you're just doomed to repeat your parents' mistakes. Oh, you're just stuck in this generational poverty, this generational addiction, whatever. Actually, a lot of times people who do go through this grow out of it and don't pass it on to their children, right? So that would be post-traumatic growth rather than post-traumatic maybe regression.
Yes. So post-traumatic growth goes hand in hand with use of the word a minute ago, resiliency. It is your ability to bounce back when you get knocked down. And there are some studies that have indicated that a person's RQ, their resiliency quotient, is actually a greater indicator of success in life than their IQ or even their EQ, your emotional intelligence.
Which is probably due to the fact that your IQ is going to go maybe up and down 5 or so points.
Right.
Through the course of your life. You can't really grow your IQ very much, but your RQ is malleable. It can change based on hard work.
Yeah, resiliency can be taught. It can be learned through life experience. And here's where spirituality really comes in, is that the more that somebody's faith becomes a central part of their life, the more resilient that they tend to become.
Yeah.
And we develop this enhanced capacity to bounce back. By the way, in our story that we started out with, when I was sharing about my friend, I'll never forget, as a lot of people were standing around expressing kind of aggressively their feelings about how she was acting, and some of them saying some pretty nasty things. One of her kids looked at me and they said, "Brother Robbie, is my mom going to be okay?" And I said, "Your mom is going to be just fine." I didn't have much pastoral tact in the time, basically. So I'm going to tell you what I said. I said, "Your mom's going to be just fine if all these self-righteous people can leave her alone and let her grieve the way that she needs to."
Real.
Here's what I know, and I don't know everything, but I do know this. There's no manual for how we grieve. You grieve how you grieve. I say the same thing to everybody that tells me I shouldn't be feeling this way. My response is always, "Who told you that? You have a right to feel whatever you feel."
Yeah.
Right. And in fact, until you acknowledge your feelings, you're probably not going to heal from those feelings.
True.
So her pain was intense. It was loud. It was terrifying. It's a miracle she didn't have a concussion. But you know what? I remember a long time later when she reached out and she said, "Robbie, I just want to let you know I don't go to the cemetery as often as I used to anymore. I'm not going to the grave every day anymore." That was huge. I didn't ask her. She wanted me to know that. What she's telling me is this: I'm beginning to process through the experience of my life, and I'm starting to figure out that there's going to be life beyond this. She never said I'm okay with it. She never said I'm the same as before, but she made it.
Yeah.
When we don't give people permission to feel what they're feeling, we make it impossible, I think, for them to ever really truly heal. You gotta realize life has brought me this, and I've got to acknowledge it. And so in a deliverance context, when we're praying with somebody that maybe they feel like they're possessed, or maybe they feel like they're overtaken by something else, and it's so noisy and it's so loud inside, maybe it's spiritual.
Yeah.
But maybe the thing that happened when they were 15 years old, they've never felt safe to tell anybody.
Yeah.
So because they haven't felt safe to tell anybody, they've had no outlet for their anger, their fear, their sorrow, their sense of loss.
Yeah.
And when we can begin to create safe spaces where people can just let that out, God is so amazing to bring healing in those moments.
Yeah.
It's crazy. Quick story. A few years ago, I went to a monastery retreat in Minnesota. I was finishing up my last degree, and it was offered as a class, a spiritual gifts and spiritual fruit laboratory is how they referred to it. Easily one of the greatest experiences of my life. Now, I remember those classes, it was stupid, the length of it. I mean, It started in the morning, and sometimes we didn't wrap up till 10, 11 o'clock at night, right? And it was so tiresome. And because it wasn't just academic, it was this community, this embodied, incarnate experience. But I remember, it'd been over 20 years, since I lost your brothers. And I remember sitting down at the feet of Dr. Carolyn Tennant and just telling her, I need healing. It doesn't make any sense. It's been so long I can't even respectably talk about how I feel anymore because people don't understand it. But there's something broken inside of me that hasn't ever been fixed.
Yeah.
She didn't correct me. She didn't counsel me. She just put her hand on me and prayed for me. And in that moment, all I can describe it as is supernatural. I had wept so many times before, but as I wept that day, God healed something inside me in a very real way, which brings me to this. Maybe you felt the emotions before and then you shut it back off. Mm-hmm. And you're going, well, I tried that and it didn't help. There's moments when God releases this trauma that's stored up inside, and as you let it out, there's emotional healing. There's also physical healing. There's diseases out there that I am convinced can only be healed when people begin to truly heal from the traumas they've carried around. And one person may call that a demon, and one person may call that complex PTSD, and one person may call that something else medical. And hear me out. I'm not sure it matters.
Sure.
I'm okay with labels when they help.
Yeah.
But isn't what we really want healing? So at the end of the day, I'll let the experts fight over what it means. I'm a practitioner. And I care about scholarly exercise, but I'm going to be honest. I believe the Bible, and I appreciate all kinds of great studies that are out there. But beyond my faith in Christ, a lot of times I really don't care what we call it as much as I care that people created in the image of God are able to come back into a relationship with their Creator, be in a right relationship with themselves and with other people, and find peace. And if they can accomplish that, I think that's a win.
Yeah. And that process isn't pretty either.
Yeah.
A lot of times it's ugly. And it can be really hard whenever you are close to somebody who's going through something like that, even not to mention how hard it is to go through it.
Sure.
But when you're close to somebody who's going through something like that, a lot of times what they do doesn't make sense. The way
God
they
help
feel.
you could be raised by somebody going through that.
Yeah, no. But I just think, as pastors, as professionals, whatever your role is, as friends, as parents, as children, maybe in some cases of people who have gone through terrible things, the best thing we can do is to be present and to be wholly present.
Absolutely.
And there for that person, because sometimes what they really need is to just, you mentioned that like maybe you've tried to feel the emotion, but then you shut it off, right? Don't shut it off. Let yourself fully feel what it is that you went through, because the reality is, psychologically speaking, until your brain is able to fully reconcile with the fact that you went through something horrible and you could do nothing to change it, until you come to terms with that fully, and let yourself feel the full range of whatever feelings you need to feel, it's never going to go away. Right? You can keep trying to push it down. You can keep trying to avoid it. But until you actually accept that maybe you have to fully feel this in order for it to go away, and maybe this is who you are now.
Right.
Not to say that you can't grow, not to say that you're doomed to repeat your mistakes, but maybe you are a different person now. Probably you're never going to heal.
I appreciate you sharing that, because I was literally about to ask you, give us something you can do actionably.
Yeah.
If you're stuck in trauma and you need to heal. And so I think what you said is so vitally important. You got to become willing to feel it. I want to add a layer to that. We also need to process that, I believe, through the lens of faith.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of my favorite Bible stories is the story of Joseph. Joseph's dad favors him, and because of his dad's favor, his brothers hate him. They hate him so much that they betray him. They throw him in a pit. They strip his clothes. They sell him into slavery. You follow Joseph's life from the age of 17 to the age of 30. It's devastating, man.
Yeah.
I mean, he's sold into slavery. He goes and as a slave, he goes to work for Potiphar. Because he's a good-looking guy, Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him. And because he's a man of integrity, he won't go along.
Yeah.
So she lies and says that he assaulted her when he didn't. And so Potiphar throws him in prison, and he's in a dungeon, and he helps one person, and the guy gets out of prison. The guy forgets him.
Yeah.
I mean, you're reading the story, and you're going, how is dude still alive?
Yeah.
So then he gets out, and he has this gift to interpret dreams. So he interprets a dream for Pharaoh. There's going to be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. So this takes him from age 13 to age 44. Mm-hmm. Well, somewhere in the famine, so somewhere in that 37 to 44 mark, his brothers show up. They think he's dead, but he's very much alive. They don't recognize him, but he recognizes them. And he's now a very powerful person. He's got this great opportunity for revenge. He doesn't take it.
Yeah.
There's this moment when his brothers are terrified. By that time, Joseph's around my age. Mm-hmm. His dad dies, and his brother just know when dad's dead, Joseph's going to off us all, right? It's done. And Joseph says something to them. He says, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good.
Yeah.
To save many people alive. Here's what Joseph's saying. That's post-traumatic growth. That's resiliency.
Yeah.
That's spiritual breakthrough. Joseph's not saying God made you sell me into slavery. God made Potiphar's wife lie about me. What he's saying is this: the hand of God was on my life, and everything that went wrong, God kept turning it around to position me in a place where I could help people.
Yeah.
If I can process life like that through the lens of faith and say, you know what? I didn't make people lie about me. I didn't make people betray me. I didn't make people forget me, but I trusted God through that. God can take our trauma and he can position us for a place of fruitfulness where we can help other people that's beyond our wildest dreams. And the end of my little mini monologue here, Joseph names his two sons Ephraim and Manasseh. Manasseh means God made me forget.
Yeah.
And Ephraim means God made me fruitful in the land of my affliction.
Yeah.
Joseph came to a place in life where he was eventually not so obsessed with the things his brothers did to him.
Yeah.
And when that happened, when God made him forget, he was finally able to be fruitful in the land of his affliction. Why is that important? The land of his affliction. Joseph never asked to live in Egypt.
No.
Joseph's trauma put him in Egypt, and he became fruitful there.
Yeah.
Trauma positions us in places we didn't want to live. It changes our lives in ways that we didn't want them changed. But when we experience post-traumatic growth and we realize God's not abandoned me, God's got a purpose in my pain, we can become fruitful in the land of our affliction.
And I think in this story and in life, it all boils down to one moment where Joseph had to make a decision. Right. He could decide, do I want to be this bitter, angry, hateful person that is so controlled by what other people did to me that I've got to do everything I can just to get back at them? Or do I choose to move on and to grow anyway?
Amen.
And to forgive, right? Because what does the Bible say that in Hebrews 12 that a root of bitterness can spring up and choke the life out of the whole body, right? So Joseph could have allowed himself to stay bitter, and probably he would have never crawled out of the pit.
Sure.
Right? But at some point he made the decision, like you said, that what they had meant for evil, God had meant for good. And he took on this divine perspective that everything was worked out in his favor, and he's going to move on anyway. That doesn't mean Joseph's life got easier.
No.
Right? Joseph's life was still hard, but he chose to make the best of it anyway. And I think that's the choice that we have.
Absolutely.
Is that at some point we can decide, do we want to be a bitter, angry, hateful person and be just like the people who did everything to us? Or do we want to decide to move on? Not to move on in the sense of that
this
we
isn't
forget.
just get over it. That's not,
right.
that's
Not just get over yourself, but do we want to pick ourselves up, dust our clothes off, and decide that we're going to be fruitful anyway? Right. And I think that's the decision ultimately that the Holy Spirit empowers us to make. And that, the Bible says that God has given us power, right, to enact his plan for our lives. So at some point we make this decision. I'm going to take this power that God has given me. I'm going to take the opportunity that God's given me, and I'm going to stand up, dust myself off, and get to work. Right. And that included for Joseph, and I think includes for most of us, forgiving people who wronged us.
Totally agree. And so you've given some really good advice on healing from trauma. If I'm carrying that around, what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to give myself permission to feel my feelings.
Yeah.
I'm going to find a safe place where I can do that.
And feel all your feelings.
Yes.
Not just the ones that aren't scary.
Yeah, let it out. And when I acknowledge, okay, the pain I'm feeling in my body is directly related to what I'm feeling in my mind.
Yeah.
Acknowledge it and release it. But then we become willing to do a couple other things. You said it. We become willing to forgive. Mm-hmm. And we become willing to reprocess our life story through the lens of, instead of I'm a victim and everybody hates me and everything goes wrong, I begin to process it through the lens of grace, where I acknowledge, yes, a lot of bad things happened and a lot of people betrayed me. But to quote Joseph, but God.
Yeah.
But God meant it for good. And so through all of this, what was I doing? I was becoming stronger. I was growing. I was getting a new vision for life. And there comes a moment when you say, you know what, I'm going forward. And I may not be able to say I'm glad those things happened to me.
Sure.
Some people can say that, and some people never can. What I can say is I recognize that my story made me who I am today. Mm-hmm. So through the lens of faith and by the power of the name of Jesus Christ, I'm going to go forward. And if demon powers oppose me, what's the old saying? Get thee behind me, Satan.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We sing it. We sing the song, "Open the grave, I'm coming out. I'm going to live again." You know?
Yeah.
So, final thoughts?
I think that's it from me.
Well, it's been a good conversation, Tim. I appreciate you sharing your insight. By the way, for any of our listeners, we may have said this last time, but it's been a while. Tim is now doing applied behavioral analysis, ABA therapy with kids on the spectrum, and you recently passed your registered behavioral technician certification.
Yeah, like Tuesday.
Yeah, so pretty excited about that opportunity to apply some of what you learned, through your psych program.
For sure.
And who knows what the future holds. So until next time, y'all be abundantly blessed. By the way, be looking for my book. It's getting ready to come out. The Deliverance Dialogues, Perspectives in Mental Illness and Demonic Influence.
Yeah.
That should be out by the end of the month through Whipfenstock, and at some point will be available on Amazon, or you can get a copy from me personally as well. We'll be having a lot of these conversations. It deals with some case studies, but it also draws real heavily from a lot of a little heavier research as well. Not heavier than today's conversation, but what I mean is overall, we keep things a little bit more fast-paced usually in this setting. That's going to give you some of the nuts and bolts that you can really dig in and try to gain some understanding.
Yeah, and you can keep an eye out for that. We'll post it on Facebook. We'll post it on Instagram. It'll probably go up on Patreon as well.
Right.
It'll go up on a few different places, but just keep an eye out for it. We'll get it posted so you can get a copy if you want one.
Absolutely. Y'all be blessed.